the moment I walked into the Monday morning team meeting and saw Diana Walsh sitting in the director's chair, I knew my mother-in-law had just served me the ace of all manipulations. Diana smiled that practiced country club smile and announced she'd be implementing some immediate changes to improve our marketing department's performance. What she didn't know was that I'd been watching her tennis game for months, and just like on the court, her strategy was all flash with no substance. Patricia had managed to get her tennis partner hired as my new boss, thinking she could finally put me in my place through corporate hierarchy. Little did either of them realize that I wasn't just another marketing analyst they could steamroll. I was Sarah Mitchell, former Texas State junior tennis champion, and I hadn't lost a match that mattered yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of TechFlow Solutions conference room cast harsh shadows across Diana Walsh's face as she shuffled through her notes with the nervous energy of someone playing out of their league. I sat in my usual spot at the oval table, surrounded by my colleagues who were equally puzzled by this sudden leadership change. Carlos Rivera, our senior developer, caught my eye and raised an eyebrow in silent question. I could only shrug in response, though internally I was connecting dots that painted a very clear picture of my mother-in-law's latest power play. Diana cleared her throat and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about bringing fresh perspectives and elevated standards to our department. Her voice carried that artificially confident tone I recognized from the tennis court when she was trying to psych out an opponent before a serve. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was attempting the same strategy here, in a conference room instead of center court. Our previous director, Mark Stevens, had been an excellent leader who trusted his team and fostered collaboration. His sudden departure for a position at a competing firm had shocked everyone, especially since he'd seemed content and successful in his role. Now watching Diana fumble through basic company terminology while outlining her vision for restructuring our established workflows, I began to understand that Mark's exit might not have been as voluntary as we'd been told. The meeting dragged on for nearly an hour as Diana outlined new reporting structures, revised project timelines, and mandatory weekly one-on-one reviews with each team member. Every suggestion seemed designed to micromanage processes that had been running smoothly for years. When she announced that all external vendor relationships would need her personal approval, I watched our usually composed graphic designer Jennifer visibly wince. We'd built strong partnerships with freelancers and agencies that Diana was now threatening to disrupt with unnecessary bureaucracy. As the meeting concluded, Diana's gaze lingered on me with unmistakable calculation. The other team members began filing out, but she called my name with deceptive casualness. "Sarah, could you stay behind for a moment? I'd like to discuss your role specifically." The conference room emptied except for the two of us, and Diana's demeanor shifted noticeably. Gone was the nervous energy, replaced by something sharper and more deliberate. She sat back in her chair and studied me with the same intensity she brought to reading an opponent's serve. "I've been reviewing your work history here at TechFlow," she began, her tone suggesting she'd found something problematic. 3 years in the same position, working on relatively small campaigns. "I'm wondering if you've reached your ceiling here." The comment was clearly intended to rattle me, but I'd faced more intimidating opponents across a tennis net than Diana Walsh would ever be across a conference table. I've consistently exceeded my performance targets and contributed to several major campaign successes, I replied evenly, including the sports analytics platform launch that brought in our biggest client to date. Diana's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I noticed that project on your record. Interesting that someone without sports industry experience would be assigned to such an important account." There it was, the first real volley, in what I now recognized as a carefully orchestrated campaign. Diana had clearly been briefed by Patricia about my background, or rather what Patricia assumed was my complete background. My mother-in-law knew I'd played tennis in high school, but had no idea about the state championship, the scholarship offers I'd turned down, or the sports marketing connections I'd maintained throughout college and beyond. "I believe in thorough research and preparation for any project," I responded, not taking the bait to reveal more than necessary. The client was satisfied with the results. Satisfied, yes, Diana conceded, consulting her notes with theatrical precision. But I can't help wondering if we left opportunities on the table. Someone with deeper industry connections might have secured additional contracts or expanded the scope. The criticism was professionally delivered but personally motivated, and we both knew it. This wasn't about my performance or potential missed opportunities. This was about establishing dominance and justifying whatever changes Diana had planned for my role. I recognized the pattern from watching her tennis matches, where she'd try to get inside her opponent's head with subtle comments about their form or strategy. I'm always open to feedback and opportunities for growth, I said, maintaining professional composure while mentally preparing for whatever came next. Diana stood and moved to the window overlooking downtown Austin, her back to me as she continued. I'm implementing a new performance review system for all staff, weekly check-ins, detailed project analysis, and specific measurable outcomes for every initiative. I expect we'll quickly identify who's ready for increased responsibility and who might be better suited for different roles. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Diana was establishing a system that would allow her to document any performance issues she chose to create, building a case for whatever personnel decisions she wanted to make. I'd seen similar strategies in corporate environments before, though never directed at me personally. That sounds very thorough, I replied neutrally, refusing to give her the defensive reaction she was clearly seeking. She turned back to face me, and for a moment, her mask slipped slightly. I caught a glimpse of the insecurity beneath the aggressive facade, the awareness that she was in over her head, in a position she hadn't earned through merit. It was the same look I'd seen on her face during tennis matches when she realized her opponent was more skilled than she'd anticipated. I'm sure you understand the importance of proving yourself in any new dynamic, Diana said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor by explaining the obvious. Fresh leadership often reveals capabilities that weren't previously recognized or utilized. I nodded acknowledgement while mentally cataloging everything about this interaction for future reference. Diana was following a script, probably outlined during conversations with Patricia over their regular tennis sessions. The approach was methodical: attack my confidence, question my competence, and establish her authority through thinly veiled threats of professional consequences. After I was dismissed from the conference room, I returned to my desk with a mixture of frustration and strategic clarity. My colleagues were clustered around Carlos's workstation, discussing the morning's developments in hushed tones. Their concerned expressions confirmed that I wasn't the only one who recognized the problematic direction our department was heading. That was intense, Jennifer whispered as I joined their informal huddle. She basically criticized everything we've accomplished in the past year. Did you notice how she kept checking her phone during the presentation? Carlos added. Like she was following notes someone else had written. Their observations aligned with my own suspicions about Diana's preparation and motivations. This wasn't someone who had been recruited for her innovative ideas or leadership capabilities. This was someone who had been installed for very specific purposes that had nothing to do with improving our department's performance. Throughout the rest of the day, I found myself analyzing the situation from multiple angles. Patricia's involvement was obvious, but the scope of her influence was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Getting Diana hired required connections and leverage that went beyond simple networking. Someone with significant influence had made calls, applied pressure, or offered incentives to place Diana in this position. The more I considered the timing and circumstances, the more I realized this wasn't just about personal animosity toward me. Patricia was orchestrating something larger, using Diana as a proxy to exert control over my professional life in ways that would be difficult to challenge or prove. It was a sophisticated form of harassment disguised as corporate restructuring. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael asking how my day was going. The innocent question felt loaded with complexity, given what I now understood about his mother's latest machinations. Michael had always struggled with setting boundaries with Patricia, preferring to avoid conflict rather than address her inappropriate interference in our lives. His conflict avoidance had enabled increasingly bold behavior from his mother, culminating in this direct assault on my career. I typed back a brief response about the new director and department changes, keeping the tone neutral. Michael's reply expressed sympathy about workplace transitions, but showed no recognition of his mother's likely involvement. Whether he was genuinely oblivious or choosing willful ignorance remained unclear, but either way, I couldn't count on his support in addressing this situation. As the afternoon progressed, Diana made her presence felt throughout the office, with impromptu desk visits and unsolicited feedback on ongoing projects. Her comments consistently undermined team members' confidence, while positioning herself as the solution to problems that hadn't existed until her arrival. It was a masterclass in corporate manipulation, professionally delivered but destructively intentioned. When she stopped by my desk around 4 o'clock, Diana's smile held all the warmth of a championship point celebration at someone else's expense. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. I'd like to start your weekly reviews tomorrow. Say, 8 a.m. in my office?" The timing was deliberately inconvenient, requiring me to arrive earlier than usual and immediately report to her office before beginning my actual work. It was a power play designed to establish hierarchy and disrupt my normal routine, but I maintained professional composure in my response. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Of course I'll be there," I confirmed, already planning how to use these mandatory meetings to gather intelligence about Diana's real agenda and Patricia's broader strategy. As I gathered my belongings to leave for the day, I reflected on the strange irony of my situation. Patricia thought she'd checkmated me by installing her tennis partner as my supervisor, creating a dynamic where I'd be subjected to constant criticism and potential career damage. What she didn't realize was that I'd learned to read Diana's game years before either of them recognized me as a threat worth targeting. The drive home through Austin traffic gave me time to process the day's events and begin formulating a response strategy. Patricia had escalated our ongoing conflict into professional territory, believing she could use corporate hierarchy to achieve what direct confrontation had failed to accomplish. She'd underestimated both my resilience and my resources, assuming that I was as powerless in my career as I sometimes appeared in family situations. Walking into our townhouse in Muller, I was greeted by the familiar sight of Michael at his laptop, code scrolling across the screen as he worked on his latest project. His focused concentration on technical problems that had clear solutions highlighted the contrast with the interpersonal complexities that consistently overwhelmed him. When he looked up to greet me, his expression held concern that suggested he'd picked up on my subdued energy despite my neutral texts. "Rough first day with the new boss?" he asked, closing his laptop to give me his full attention. I considered how much to share, weighing the potential benefits of his support against the likelihood of him minimizing the situation, or, worse, defending his mother's innocence in Diana's hiring. "She's definitely going to bring changes to how we operate," I said carefully. "Change can be good," Michael replied with the optimism of someone who hadn't spent the day being systematically undermined by a professionally delivered character assassination campaign. "Maybe fresh perspective will help the department grow." His response confirmed my suspicion that he remained oblivious to his mother's involvement or influence in my workplace situation. Whether this was willful blindness or genuine ignorance, it meant I'd be navigating this challenge largely on my own, at least initially. As we prepared dinner together, I found myself mentally preparing for what I now recognized as a sustained campaign against my professional standing. Diana's approach would likely be methodical and well-documented, designed to build a case for my inadequacy while appearing to follow proper management procedures. Patricia had chosen her proxy, while Diana possessed enough corporate experience to execute sophisticated manipulation while maintaining plausible deniability about personal motivations. But there was something Patricia and Diana didn't know about me, something that would become increasingly relevant as this corporate tennis match progressed. I wasn't just another marketing analyst who could be intimidated into resignation or demotion. I was someone with connections, knowledge, and capabilities they'd never bothered to discover because they'd already decided who they thought I was. The game was just beginning, and while they'd served the first ace, I had no intention of losing this match. That evening, as I reviewed my professional portfolio and began reaching out to contacts I hadn't spoken with in months, I felt the familiar competitive fire that had once driven me to a state championship. Patricia thought she'd put me in an impossible position, trapped between family loyalty and career survival. What she'd actually done was remind me exactly who I used to be before I'd allowed marriage and family dynamics to diminish my sense of professional identity and personal power. Tomorrow's 8 a.m. meeting with Diana would be the beginning of my comeback, though she'd have no idea she was about to face an opponent who'd been playing at championship level long before either of them picked up a racket. The next morning arrived with the oppressive August heat that made Austin's summers legendary, and I found myself standing outside TechFlow Solutions at 7:45, watching Diana Walsh through the glass doors as she arranged papers on what used to be Mark Stevens' desk. Her movements were precise but nervous, like a player preparing for a match against an opponent whose skill level remained unknown. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my blazer, and walked through those doors with the confidence of someone who had faced down match point before and lived to tell about it. Diana's office, formerly Mark's collaborative space filled with team photos and project whiteboards, had been transformed overnight into something resembling a tennis club boardroom. Gone were the casual seating arrangements and open-door policy visual cues. In their place sat a formal desk setup with Diana positioned behind it like a judge, two uncomfortable chairs facing her for what she clearly intended to be interrogations rather than conversations. The subtle power dynamics weren't lost on me, though I suspected Diana had learned this particular intimidation technique from Patricia's playbook rather than developing it through actual management experience. "Sarah, punctual as always," Diana said, glancing at her watch with theatrical precision as I entered exactly at 8. "Please, have a seat. I've prepared some discussion points for our first formal review." I settled into the indicated chair and observed Diana's setup with the analytical eye I'd once used to study opponents' court positioning. Her notepad was filled with bullet points written in Patricia's distinctively neat handwriting, though Diana probably thought she was being subtle about consulting external guidance. The questions she'd prepared revealed far more about their strategy than she realized, focusing heavily on my background, connections, and long-term career aspirations rather than current job performance. "Let's start with your educational background," Diana began, reading directly from her notes. "I see you have an MBA from UT Austin. What drew you to marketing rather than pursuing other business opportunities?" The question was designed to probe for vulnerabilities or unfulfilled ambitions that could be exploited later. I'd encountered similar psychological tactics from tennis opponents who tried to get inside their competitor's head by questioning their motivation or commitment. "Marketing allows me to combine analytical thinking with creative problem-solving," I replied. "The variety keeps me engaged, and I enjoy seeing strategies translate into measurable results." Diana nodded and made notes that seemed disproportionately lengthy for my brief response. Other than amusing evidence of genetic impracticality. "And your work experience before joining TechFlow? I noticed some gaps in your resume that raised questions." Here was the fishing expedition I'd expected. Patricia had obviously briefed Diana about my background, but their knowledge contained significant blind spots that I had no intention of filling during this conversation. "I spent some time consulting while completing my MBA," I said truthfully, though omitting the detail that my consulting work had been with major sports equipment manufacturers and tournament organizers. The experience taught me to adapt quickly to different industry requirements. "Consulting," Diana repeated, as though the word tasted suspicious. "That's quite vague." "What type of consulting? And with which companies?" Her persistence revealed the coaching she'd received about extracting specific information that could be used against me later. I recognized the pattern from watching Patricia interrogate family members during holiday gatherings, probing for details that would later surface in strategic gossip sessions, designed to undermine someone's credibility or status. "Various marketing projects across different sectors," I replied, maintaining the same level of specificity she was likely to receive. "Confidentiality agreements limit what I can discuss about specific clients, but the work gave me valuable experience in rapid market analysis and campaign development." Diana's frustration flickered across her face as she realized I wasn't going to provide the ammunition she'd been sent to collect. She switched tactics, moving to questions about my current role and future aspirations within the company. "TechFlow is growing rapidly," she said, consulting her notes again. "We need team members who can scale with increased responsibility and more complex challenges. How do you see your role evolving over the next year?" The question contained an implicit threat about my current position's security, while demanding that I advocate for responsibilities that Diana could later claim I was unprepared to handle. It was a sophisticated trap that revealed both Patricia's strategic thinking and Diana's willingness to execute ethically questionable management practices. "I'm committed to contributing wherever my skills are most valuable to the team and company goals," I replied. "I prefer to let my work quality speak for itself, rather than lobbying for specific advancement opportunities." This response clearly frustrated Diana further, as it provided no basis for claiming I was either overly ambitious or lacking professional drive. She spent several more minutes probing for weaknesses in my professional confidence or team relationships, but I maintained consistent professional responses that gave her nothing substantial to document as concerning. The meeting concluded with Diana outlining weekly deliverables that were significantly more detailed and time-consuming than what any other team member was required to produce. She wanted daily progress reports on all projects, advance copies of any client communications, and detailed analysis of time allocation across various tasks. The administrative burden was designed to constrain my actual productivity while creating opportunities for criticism about efficiency or attention to detail. "I'll expect the first weekly summary by Friday afternoon," Diana said, handing me a printed template that looked suspiciously like something Patricia might have designed for managing household staff. "This will help us identify areas where additional support or training might be beneficial." I accepted the template with the same neutral professionalism I'd maintained throughout the meeting, though internally I was noting every detail for future reference. Diana's approach was systematically designed to create documentation that could support performance concerns while appearing to follow proper management procedures. It was corporate harassment disguised as professional development, executed with enough sophistication to make challenging it extremely difficult. Returning to my desk after the meeting, I found Carlos waiting with coffee and the concerned expression of someone who'd witnessed one too many questionable management decisions throughout his career. "How'd it go in there?" he asked quietly, glancing toward Diana's office. "Educational," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She's definitely establishing a new management style." Carlos lowered his voice further. "Jennifer heard from someone in HR that Diana's previous position ended under unclear circumstances, something about conflicts with team members and disputed performance evaluations." This information added crucial context to Diana's current behavior and suggested that her hiring hadn't involved the thorough vetting process tech flow typically employed for senior positions. Someone with significant influence had fast-tracked her appointment, bypassing normal procedures that might have revealed problematic patterns in her management history. Throughout the rest of that week, Diana's presence dominated the department's atmosphere in increasingly uncomfortable ways. She implemented daily team stand-up meetings that felt more like interrogations than collaborative planning sessions. She questioned established workflows that had been producing excellent results, suggesting changes that would centralize decision-making through her office, while creating bottlenecks that hampered efficiency. Most troubling was her approach to our external relationships. Diana began inserting herself into client communications, often contradicting strategies that were already in progress and creating confusion about project direction. When I mentioned concerns about mixed messaging to our sports analytics client, she dismissed them as resistance to necessary improvements rather than legitimate operational issues. The sports analytics account, which had been one of my most successful projects, became Diana's particular focus of attention. She scheduled multiple meetings with the client without including me, despite my primary responsibility for the relationship. When I requested information about these discussions to maintain project continuity, Diana claimed she was conducting high-level strategic conversations that didn't require my input. By Thursday afternoon, I received an email from the client expressing confusion about conflicting information they'd received regarding campaign timeline and deliverables. Diana's unauthorized communications had undermined months of carefully built trust and threatened to jeopardize our largest account. When I forwarded the client's concerns to Diana, she scheduled an immediate meeting to discuss what she termed my failure to properly coordinate team communications. "This situation with the sports analytics account is exactly what I was concerned about," Diana said during our impromptu Thursday meeting. "The client is clearly receiving mixed messages, which suggests problems with project management and communication protocols." Her ability to reframe the crisis she'd created as evidence of my inadequacy was impressive in its audacity. She'd caused the confusion through unauthorized client contact, then positioned the resulting problems as validation of her concerns about my performance. It was a masterful example of professional gaslighting, executed with enough plausible deniability to make direct confrontation extremely difficult. "I'd be happy to clarify any communication issues," I offered. "Since I've managed this relationship from the beginning, I can provide context about previous agreements and expectations. Actually, I think this presents an opportunity for fresh perspective," Diana replied smoothly. "I'll be taking over direct client management for this account effective immediately. You can transition to supporting research and documentation, which seems better aligned with your demonstrated capabilities." The demotion was delivered with professional courtesy that couldn't disguise its punitive nature. Diana was systematically removing my responsibilities while creating documentation that suggested the changes reflected my limitations rather than her arbitrary management decisions. Within 1 week, she'd reduced my role from senior analyst managing major accounts to administrative support for projects she would control. Friday's weekly summary submission felt like writing my own professional obituary. The template Diana had provided required detailed justification for every hour of work, analysis of challenges encountered, and self-assessment of areas needing improvement. It was designed to elicit admissions of inadequacy that could be used to support future disciplinary actions or termination proceedings. As I completed the demoralizing document, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia suggesting we meet for lunch over the weekend to discuss family matters. The timing wasn't coincidental. Diana had obviously briefed her about the week's developments, and Patricia wanted to assess the effectiveness of their corporate campaign while positioning herself as a concerned family member rather than the architect of my professional destruction. That Friday evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the week's events and their broader implications. Diana's systematic dismantling of my role was proceeding exactly as Patricia had probably planned, using corporate hierarchy and professional procedures to achieve what direct confrontation had failed to accomplish. They'd created a sophisticated form of workplace harassment that would be nearly impossible to challenge through normal HR channels, since Diana's actions could be defended as legitimate management decisions rather than personal vendetta execution. But as I researched Diana's background and previous employment history, patterns began emerging that suggested vulnerabilities in their seemingly perfect strategy. Her previous position had ended following conflicts with team members who'd filed formal complaints about her management style. The complaints had been settled quietly, with Diana receiving a severance package in exchange for resignation, rather than facing formal disciplinary proceedings. More interesting was Diana's complete lack of experience in sports marketing or technology sectors. Her background was primarily in traditional retail management, with no relevant expertise for leading a team responsible for sports analytics campaigns. Her hiring made sense only if someone had prioritized personal connections over professional qualifications, which suggested that TechFlow's leadership might be receptive to concerns about her appointment if presented with compelling evidence. I spent the weekend developing a careful strategy for addressing the situation without appearing to challenge Diana's authority directly, or creating appearance of sour grapes about management changes. Instead, I would focus on operational concerns and client relationships, positioning myself as someone prioritizing company success over personal comfort with new reporting structures. Monday morning brought another early meeting with Diana, this time scheduled for 7:30 to discuss my transition to supporting roles. She'd clearly spent the weekend planning how to formalize my demotion while maintaining plausible deniability about the motivations behind personnel changes. "Sarah, I've been reviewing your weekly summary and thinking about optimal team structure going forward," Diana began, consulting notes that again appeared to be written in Patricia's handwriting. "I believe we can better utilize your analytical skills in research and documentation roles, while I handle direct client relationships and strategic decision-making." The restructuring was presented as organizational improvement rather than punishment, though we both understood its true purpose. Diana was methodically removing my visibility and influence within the department, while creating documentation that suggested the changes reflected careful consideration of team members' strengths and capabilities. "I want to ensure we maintain strong client relationships during any transition period," I replied carefully. The sports analytics account involves complex technical specifications and established communication protocols that might benefit from continuity during the changeover. Diana's expression tightened slightly at my subtle suggestion that her takeover might disrupt client satisfaction. I appreciate your concern, but I believe fresh perspective will actually strengthen those relationships. The client expressed interest in exploring expanded services that require senior-level strategic thinking. Her response revealed that she'd been in unauthorized contact with the client again, probably making promises about expanded services without understanding the technical limitations or budget constraints that governed our contract. Diana was setting up both herself and the company for failures that she would inevitably blame on inadequate support from team members like me. The meeting continued with Diana outlining my new responsibilities, which consisted primarily of research tasks and administrative support that utilized none of my strategic thinking or client relationship capabilities. She was systematically reducing my role to entry-level functions while maintaining my senior analyst title, creating cognitive dissonance that was psychologically designed to encourage resignation rather than adaptation. As I returned to my desk after the meeting, I noticed that several colleagues were watching me with expressions mixing sympathy and concern. Diana's treatment of me was obviously problematic to anyone observing objectively, but corporate culture often discouraged direct challenges to management decisions, especially from team members who might fear similar treatment. Carlos approached my desk quietly once Diana had left for another client meeting. "This is getting out of hand," he said quietly. "She's completely reorganizing everything that was working well, and now she's basically demoting you for no legitimate reason." His observation confirmed that Diana's actions appeared as arbitrary and unfair to objective observers as they felt to me personally. This external validation was crucial for maintaining perspective and avoiding the self-doubt that harassment campaigns were designed to create in their targets. "Change is always challenging," I replied diplomatically, aware that office conversations could be easily mischaracterized if they reached Diana's attention. "I'm sure we'll find our rhythm with the new structure." But privately, I was developing a more assertive response strategy. Diana's systematic demolition of my professional standing had crossed lines that even creative management styles couldn't justify. Her actions were creating operational problems that affected client relationships and team morale, providing legitimate grounds for raising concerns through appropriate channels. That afternoon, while Diana was out of the office for another unauthorized client meeting, I began documenting the timeline of changes and their impact on team productivity and client satisfaction. I also reached out discreetly to contacts in other departments who might provide context about Diana's hiring process and the decision-making behind Mark Stevens' sudden departure. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Mark had been pressured to resign following complaints about his management that had originated from external sources rather than internal performance issues. Someone with significant influence over TechFlow's leadership had orchestrated his removal to create the opening that Diana now occupied. As I pieced together the broader conspiracy, I realized that Patricia's influence extended far beyond social connections at the country club. She had relationships with TechFlow's board members and investors that gave her leverage over personnel decisions. Diana's hiring wasn't just about placing a tennis partner in a position of authority over me. It was about demonstrating Patricia's capacity to manipulate corporate environments and professional relationships. The scope of her interference was breathtaking in its audacity and sophisticated in its execution. Patricia had weaponized corporate hierarchy to achieve personal objectives, using Diana as a proxy to exercise control over my career in ways that would be nearly impossible to challenge or prove. But understanding the full scope of their conspiracy also revealed its potential weaknesses. Patricia's manipulation required secrecy and plausible deniability to be effective. If her influence over Diana's hiring became widely known, it would create legal and ethical problems for both TechFlow's leadership and Diana herself. Corporate governance policies strictly prohibited the kind of external interference that had clearly shaped recent personnel decisions. As Tuesday evening approached, I felt a familiar competitive energy building within me. Patricia and Diana had assumed they were playing against someone who would accept defeat gracefully rather than fighting back strategically. They'd underestimated both my analytical capabilities and my competitive instincts, assuming that professional environments would constrain my responses in ways that tennis courts never had. What they didn't realize was that I'd been studying their game much longer than they'd been studying mine. And unlike them, I wasn't playing with borrowed authority or external support. I was preparing to compete with skills, knowledge, and connections that were authentically my own. The match was far from over, and I was just getting warmed up. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected reprieve from Diana's intensive micromanagement when she called in sick with what she described as a migraine. The sudden absence felt like a pressure valve release, allowing the department to function normally for the first time in over a week. Carlos and I exchanged knowing glances as we settled into productive work rhythms that had been impossible under Diana's constant surveillance and interruptions. Without Diana's hovering presence, I was able to reconnect with the sports analytics client who had been expressing concerns about conflicting communications. The conversation revealed that Diana had indeed been making unauthorized promises about expanded services that exceeded our contract scope and technical capabilities. More troubling, she had been positioning herself as the primary relationship manager, while characterizing me as a junior team member who lacked decision-making authority. "I have to be honest, Sarah," said Marcus Chen, the client's project director, during our call. "The mixed messages have been concerning. Your new director seems enthusiastic, but some of her proposals don't align with our technical requirements or budget parameters. We've been working so well together that I wanted to clarify the chain of command before we get too far into implementation." His diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying message that Diana's interference was jeopardizing a relationship that had taken months to build. The client preferred working with me but was confused about who actually held authority over project decisions. Diana's power grab was creating exactly the kind of operational chaos that could provide legitimate grounds for management intervention. "I appreciate your directness, Marcus," I replied carefully. "Let me coordinate with Diana when she returns to ensure we're all aligned on project scope and communication protocols. Our priority is delivering the results you need within the agreed parameters." After the call, I spent considerable time documenting the client's concerns and Diana's unauthorized commitments. The pattern of behavior was becoming clear enough to present to senior leadership, but I needed to be strategic about timing and presentation to avoid appearing like a disgruntled employee, making personal complaints about management style. That afternoon, while researching Diana's background more thoroughly, I discovered something that shifted my entire understanding of the situation. Diana Walsh had been terminated from her previous position at Morrison & Associates following allegations of falsifying client credentials and misrepresenting project outcomes. The termination had been negotiated as a resignation to avoid legal proceedings, but the underlying conduct violations were documented in industry networks that Patricia obviously hadn't consulted before orchestrating Diana's placement at TechFlow. This information changed everything. Diana wasn't just an unqualified hire placed through personal connections. She was someone with a documented history of professional misconduct who had been hired without proper vetting. TechFlow's leadership would face serious liability issues if they'd failed to conduct appropriate background checks, especially given the sensitive nature of our client relationships and proprietary information access. I spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting my research findings and preparing a comprehensive analysis of operational concerns that had emerged since Diana's arrival. The document focused strictly on business impacts rather than personal grievances, presenting evidence that would compel senior leadership to investigate the circumstances surrounding Diana's hiring and current performance. Thursday brought Diana's return to the office with renewed aggression that suggested her day away had been spent strategizing rather than recovering from illness. She scheduled an immediate all-hands meeting to announce additional organizational changes that would further centralize authority through her position, while reducing other team members' autonomy and visibility. "I've been reflecting on our operational efficiency and communication protocols," Diana announced to the assembled team. "Effective immediately, all client contact will be routed through my office to ensure consistent messaging and strategic alignment. Team members will focus on execution of approved strategies rather than independent relationship management." The policy change was sweeping enough to affect everyone's role, but its primary target was obviously me. By eliminating direct client contact, Diana was removing my strongest professional advantage, while creating opportunities to take credit for successful outcomes that resulted from my strategic work. It was corporate theft disguised as management restructuring. Carlos raised his hand with uncharacteristic boldness. Will this change affect ongoing projects where team members have established working relationships with client contacts? Some of our technical discussions require deep subject matter expertise that might be difficult to route through intermediary channels. His question highlighted the operational problems with Diana's decree while avoiding direct challenge to her authority. Other team members nodded in agreement, recognizing that the new protocols would create bottlenecks and communication delays that could harm project outcomes. Diana's response revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of our actual work processes. All technical discussions can be summarized through proper reporting channels, she said dismissively. If team members are unable to communicate their expertise through appropriate management structures, we may need to evaluate whether they possess the communication skills necessary for their current roles. The implicit threat was clear: anyone who challenged the new protocols would face questions about their professional capabilities rather than legitimate concerns about operational effectiveness. Diana was using intimidation tactics to suppress objections while positioning resistance as evidence of inadequate performance. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me privately to express frustration with the changes and concern about their impact on client relationships. The consensus was that Diana's policies would harm both team morale and project outcomes, but fear of retaliation prevented open discussion of these concerns. "This is insane," Jennifer whispered during a brief conversation near the coffee station. "She's basically isolating us from the clients we've spent years building relationships with. How is that supposed to improve anything?" Her question captured the disconnect between Diana's stated objectives and actual outcomes. The new policies would damage client satisfaction while reducing team members' professional development opportunities, achieving the opposite of effective management. But pointing out these contradictions required someone willing to challenge Diana's authority despite potential consequences. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I scheduled a meeting with Janet Morrison, TechFlow's Vice President of Operations, to discuss operational concerns that had emerged following recent departmental changes. The conversation would require careful presentation to avoid appearing like personal complaints while highlighting legitimate business impacts that demanded senior leadership attention. Friday morning arrived with unusual September coolness that felt like nature's encouragement for the challenging conversation ahead. I had prepared extensively, organizing documentation and rehearsing key points to ensure professional presentation of complex concerns. The meeting with Janet represented my first direct challenge to Diana's authority, crossing a line that would make continued coexistence under current dynamics impossible. Janet Morrison's office reflected her reputation for analytical thinking and direct communication. Charts tracking various operational metrics covered one wall, while her desk displayed award recognition for innovative management practices. She greeted me with professional warmth that suggested genuine interest in employee concerns, rather than perfunctory obligation to hear complaints. "Sarah, thank you for reaching out," Janet said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area away from her formal desk. "Your email mentioned operational concerns related to recent departmental changes. I'd like to understand the specific issues you've identified." Her direct approach allowed me to present my analysis without excessive preamble or defensive justification. I outlined the timeline of changes since Diana's arrival, focusing on measurable impacts rather than subjective concerns about management style. Client confusion, communication delays, and team productivity issues provided objective evidence that supplemented my documentation of Diana's unauthorized commitments and policy changes. These patterns suggest potential risks to client retention and team performance, I concluded. I wanted to bring them to your attention before they escalate into more serious operational problems. Janet reviewed my documentation carefully, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both analytical rigor and growing concern about the issues I'd presented. Her experience with organizational dynamics was evident in her ability to identify patterns that suggested deeper problems than isolated management adjustment difficulties. "The client feedback you've documented is particularly concerning," Janet observed. "Mixed messaging and unauthorized commitments create liability issues that extend beyond departmental management preferences. Have you discussed these specific concerns with Diana directly?" Her question probed whether I'd attempted to resolve issues through normal channels before escalating to senior leadership. I explained my efforts to coordinate with Diana on client communications and her dismissive responses to operational concerns, presenting myself as someone seeking solutions rather than creating additional problems. I've tried to work within the new structure, I said honestly. But the communication protocols she's implemented seem to be creating exactly the kinds of client confusion we'd normally work hard to avoid. Janet nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing implications that extended beyond my immediate concerns. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Sarah. These issues require careful investigation to ensure we're maintaining our standards for client service and team effectiveness. The conversation concluded with Janet requesting copies of all documentation I'd prepared, along with permission to follow up with clients and team members as part of her assessment. She emphasized that my concerns would be investigated objectively and that no retaliation would be tolerated for raising legitimate operational issues through appropriate channels. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I felt simultaneously relieved and apprehensive. I'd crossed the Rubicon by formally challenging Diana's management through senior leadership channels, making continued conflict inevitable while creating opportunities for resolution that hadn't previously existed. The outcome would depend on Janet's investigation findings and TechFlow's commitment to operational excellence over personal relationships. Diana was waiting at my desk when I returned, her expression suggesting she'd somehow learned about my meeting with Janet despite my careful discretion. Her smile held all the warmth of a line judge calling a double fault on match point, and I braced myself for whatever escalation she'd prepared during my absence. Sarah, I understand you had a meeting with Janet Morrison this morning, Diana said quietly, her tone suggesting she was offering me an opportunity to explain myself before implementing predetermined consequences. I hope you discussed any concerns with me first, as appropriate professional protocol would suggest. Her knowledge of my meeting raised questions about information sources and surveillance that were deeply troubling. Either Diana had contacts within senior leadership who'd reported my conversation immediately, or she was monitoring my communications and schedule in ways that violated normal workplace privacy expectations. I discussed operational concerns that affect our departmental effectiveness, I replied carefully, maintaining professional composure while documenting this interaction for future reference. I believe senior leadership should be aware of issues that impact client relationships and team performance. Diana's expression hardened slightly at my refusal to apologize or provide detailed explanation of my discussion with Janet. I see. Well, I hope you're prepared for the consequences of circumventing proper management channels. These kinds of actions often reflect poorly on team members' ability to work collaboratively within established structures. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy that couldn't disguise its intimidating intent. Diana was positioning my legitimate concerns about operational problems as evidence of poor teamwork and insubordination, setting up justification for whatever disciplinary action she was planning. I'm committed to supporting our team's success and client satisfaction, I responded evenly. I believe addressing operational concerns early helps prevent more serious problems from developing. Our exchange was interrupted by Carlos approaching with urgent client communication that required immediate attention. The sports analytics client was requesting emergency consultation about technical specifications that Diana's recent promises had thrown into question. The timing was perfect validation of the operational concerns I just presented to Janet Morrison. The client needs immediate clarification about expanded services proposals, Carlos explained, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he'd walked into. They're concerned about timeline and budget implications for deliverables that weren't in the original scope. Diana's face flushed slightly as she realized the client crisis directly contradicted her claims about improved communication and strategic alignment. She'd created exactly the kind of operational emergency that effective management was designed to prevent, and the timing made her competence impossible to defend. I'll handle client communications directly, Diana said tersely, clearly scrambling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her capabilities. Sarah, please prepare a detailed analysis of original project scope for my review. Her request for my analysis revealed the fundamental flaw in her takeover strategy. Despite removing me from direct client contact, she still depended on my expertise and institutional knowledge to manage relationships she didn't understand. Diana had assumed authority without possessing competence, creating unsustainable dynamics that would inevitably expose her inadequacy. As Diana hurried toward her office to attempt damage control with the confused client, I began preparing the analysis she'd requested while carefully documenting the crisis timeline for Janet's investigation. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Diana's management style was creating operational problems rather than solving them, while her attempts to assert control were undermining the team effectiveness she claimed to be improving. That afternoon brought additional validation of concerns I'd raised with Janet Morrison. 2 other clients reached out with questions about service changes and communication protocols that suggested Diana's reorganization was creating widespread confusion rather than improved coordination. Each interaction provided additional evidence that her management approach was fundamentally flawed and potentially damaging to TechFlow's reputation. The week concluded with Diana scheduling individual meetings with each team member, clearly attempting to assess loyalty and identify potential sources of the complaints that had reached senior leadership. Her approach was methodical but transparent, using intimidation tactics that were obvious to anyone who understood workplace dynamics and psychological manipulation. During my Friday afternoon meeting with Diana, she dispensed with professional courtesy in favor of direct confrontation. "Sarah, I want to be very clear about expectations and consequences," she began. "Team members who can't adapt to new management structures often find themselves reconsidering whether their current position is the right fit for their career goals." The termination threat was unambiguous but still couched in language that provided plausible deniability about its retaliatory nature. Diana was escalating our conflict while creating documentation that could support claims about performance issues or cultural fit problems rather than retaliation for legitimate workplace concerns. "I understand the importance of adapting to organizational changes," I replied calmly. "I'm committed to contributing effectively within whatever structure best serves our clients and company objectives." My response provided no ammunition for claims about resistance to authority or poor attitude. While subtly emphasizing my priority on client service and company success over personal comfort with management changes, Diana's frustration was evident as she realized I wasn't providing the defensive reaction she needed to justify escalated disciplinary action. The weekend provided breathing space to process the week's developments and prepare for whatever escalation Diana was planning. Her increased aggression suggested that my conversation with Janet Morrison had triggered defensive responses that would likely intensify as senior leadership's investigation progressed. The coming week would determine whether TechFlow's commitment to operational excellence would override whatever personal connections had enabled Diana's hiring. But I was no longer the isolated target Diana and Patricia had assumed they were manipulating. Janet Morrison's interest in my operational concerns suggested that senior leadership was capable of recognizing legitimate business issues regardless of their source. The documentation I'd prepared provided objective evidence that transcended personal conflicts, creating opportunities for resolution based on company interests rather than individual power struggles. As I reviewed my career portfolio and professional network over the weekend, I felt a familiar competitive energy building. Diana had assumed she was playing against someone whose career she could destroy through corporate manipulation and systematic harassment. What she'd actually done was force me to reconnect with professional skills and strategic thinking that had been dormant during my period of departmental stability and routine productivity. Patricia's sophisticated conspiracy had backfired by pushing me toward exactly the kind of assertive professional engagement she'd hoped to prevent. Instead of accepting diminished status and eventual resignation, I was fighting back with resources and capabilities that neither she nor Diana had bothered to investigate before launching their campaign. The tennis metaphor that had seemed so appropriate for their opening moves was about to become much more literal than they'd anticipated. They'd served their best shots, but the match was far from over, and I was just beginning to demonstrate what championship-level play actually looked like. Monday morning arrived with the crisp energy of October in Austin, and I walked into TechFlow Solutions carrying a leather portfolio that contained more than just routine project updates. Over the weekend, I had received a call that would change everything. A call from Tom Bradley, my former tennis coach who had become one of the most successful sports marketing agents in the country. The conversation had reminded me of connections I'd maintained quietly throughout my corporate career. Relationships that Diana and Patricia had no idea existed. Tom's agency, Bradley Sports Marketing, was expanding into technology partnerships and needed a consulting firm with expertise in both sports analytics and digital marketing. The contract he was offering would be worth more to TechFlow than every other account we currently managed combined. More importantly, Tom specifically requested me as the primary consultant, based on work I'd done for his clients during my MBA program and the championship credentials he'd never forgotten. As I settled at my desk that morning, I was aware that Diana was watching me with the intensity of a player studying an opponent's pre-serve routine. She'd spent the weekend preparing for what she expected to be my final week at TechFlow, planning the performance management documentation that would justify my termination following Janet Morrison's investigation. What she didn't know was that I was no longer playing defense. The first surprise came at 9:30, when Janet Morrison's assistant called to schedule an emergency meeting with Diana regarding, quote, operational concerns and client relationship management. The timing wasn't coincidental. Janet's investigation had obviously uncovered information that demanded immediate attention, and Diana's confident demeanor began showing cracks as she realized the consequences of her actions were finally materializing. While Diana was sequestered in Janet's office, I received the second call that would reshape our entire department's future. Marcus Chen from our sports analytics client was reaching out with urgent news that his company was considering expanding their TechFlow contract by 300%, but only if I remained as their primary relationship manager. The expansion would make us their largest account and transform our department's revenue projections for the entire fiscal year. Sarah, I need to be direct with you, Marcus said during our conversation. Your director's communications have created significant concerns about TechFlow's ability to manage complex technical projects. We've been impressed with your work over the past year, but recent interactions suggest a disconnect between your expertise and the leadership structure. Before we move forward with expansion, we need assurance that you'll continue as our primary contact. The irony was perfect. Diana's attempts to remove me from client relationships had instead highlighted my value to the point where major clients were making their continued business contingent on my involvement. Her power grab had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of client leverage that would force senior leadership to reconsider their personnel decisions. I appreciate your confidence in my work, Marcus, I replied carefully. Let me discuss the expansion proposal with our leadership team and ensure we have the right structure in place to support your needs effectively. As I documented the client's expansion offer and their specific requirements for my continued involvement, I felt the familiar rush of strategic advantage that had once carried me to championship victories. Diana had assumed she was playing against someone whose career she could destroy through manipulation and intimidation. Instead, she'd forced me to activate professional relationships and demonstrate value that made me indispensable rather than vulnerable. The morning continued with additional validation of my strategic position. Carlos approached my desk with news that other team members had been contacted by Janet Morrison's office as part of the ongoing investigation into departmental operations. The interviews were focusing on communication protocols, client relationship management, and the impact of recent organizational changes on project outcomes. Everyone's being asked about client feedback and workflow efficiency since Diana arrived, Carlos reported quietly. Jennifer said they're particularly interested in documentation about unauthorized client commitments and communication bypassing established protocols. This information confirmed that Janet's investigation was comprehensive and focused on objective operational concerns rather than subjective personality conflicts. The evidence I'd provided was being corroborated through multiple sources, creating a clear picture of management dysfunction that would be impossible for Diana to dismiss or explain away. Around 11 o'clock, Diana emerged from her meeting with Janet Morrison, looking like a player who'd just realized their opponent had been sandbagging their skill level throughout the entire match. Her face was flushed, her usual confident posture had deflated, and she walked directly to her office without making eye contact with anyone on the team. Whatever discussion had occurred in Janet's office had obviously not gone according to Diana's expectations. The third significant development of the morning came through an unexpected channel. Linda Martinez, the tennis coach at Riverside Country Club, called my direct office line with information that Patricia had apparently shared more details about her corporate interference than she'd intended during their regular tennis session. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling you at work," Linda said, her voice carrying concern that suggested she'd wrestled with whether to make this contact. Patricia was talking quite openly yesterday about how she'd arranged for Diana to get hired at your company to teach you some professional humility. She seemed to think it was a clever way to put you in your place without getting her hands dirty directly. Linda's revelation provided crucial evidence of Patricia's direct involvement in orchestrating Diana's hiring and the subsequent harassment campaign. More importantly, it demonstrated that Patricia had been careless enough to boast about her manipulation to third parties, creating witnesses who could corroborate the conspiracy if legal action became necessary. "I appreciate you sharing this information, Linda," I replied. "It helps clarify some workplace dynamics that have been confusing." "There's more," Linda continued. "Patricia also mentioned that she's planning to have Diana document performance problems that would justify firing you within the next few weeks." She seemed quite pleased with how quickly Diana was building a case for termination. This intelligence about their timeline and strategy provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Patricia's overconfidence had led her to reveal details that would make defending Diana's actions impossible once the full scope of external manipulation became known to TechFlow's leadership. After Linda's call, I spent several minutes organizing all the information I'd gathered into a comprehensive timeline that connected Patricia's social manipulation, Diana's hiring under questionable circumstances, and the systematic harassment campaign that had followed. The pattern was undeniable and legally problematic for everyone involved. Just before lunch, Tom Bradley called back with additional details about the sports marketing contract that elevated its importance beyond anything I'd initially understood. Bradley's sports marketing represented several major tennis tournaments and equipment manufacturers who were seeking technology partnerships for fan engagement and performance analytics. The contract would position TechFlow as a primary vendor for an entire industry sector, with potential for expansion that could triple our company's revenue within 2 years. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you about why this opportunity exists," Tom said during our conversation. "Your former championship status and technical expertise make you uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between sports industry needs and technology solutions. Several of my clients specifically requested someone with your background after hearing about your work in sports analytics." His explanation revealed the full scope of advantages I'd accumulated through years of maintaining quiet connections while focusing on corporate advancement. My tennis championship wasn't just personal history. It was professional credibility that opened doors in sports marketing that no amount of traditional business development could access. "The contract includes consulting fees that would make you the highest-paid individual contributor in TechFlow's history," Tom continued. "But my clients are only interested if you're the primary relationship manager with full authority over project development and execution." The financial details Tom outlined would make my termination not just operationally damaging for TechFlow, but financially catastrophic. Diana's harassment campaign had inadvertently positioned me as essential to the company's most lucrative growth opportunity, creating leverage that would force senior leadership to choose between supporting me or sacrificing millions in potential revenue. When Diana returned from her extended lunch break, her demeanor had shifted from defeated to desperate. She scheduled an immediate meeting with me that felt more like a final attempt at damage control than another harassment session. Her usual confidence had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety that suggested she'd finally grasped the scope of problems her actions had created. "Sarah, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about communication protocols and project management approaches," Diana began, her tone suggesting she was hoping to negotiate a truce rather than continue the conflict. "Perhaps we can find ways to better align our strategies going forward." Her attempt at reconciliation was too little and far too late. The damage to client relationships, team morale, and operational efficiency couldn't be undone through cosmetic adjustments to management style. More importantly, the evidence of external manipulation and systematic harassment was already in the hands of senior leadership and legal counsel. "I'm always open to improving team effectiveness," I replied neutrally, providing no indication that I was willing to forget or forgive the systematic attempt to destroy my career. Diana seemed to recognize that her offer of modified behavior wasn't going to resolve the crisis she'd created. Her next approach revealed the desperation of someone whose position had become untenable and who was grasping for any remaining leverage. I hope you realize that making accusations about management decisions could have serious consequences for your career prospects, she said, abandoning diplomacy in favor of threats. Companies don't typically promote employees who create conflicts with leadership or undermine organizational stability. Her threat confirmed that she still didn't understand the fundamental shift in our power dynamic. Diana was operating from an assumption of authority that no longer existed, making demands that she lacked leverage to enforce while creating additional evidence of retaliatory behavior. I understand the importance of organizational stability, I replied calmly. That's why I believe addressing operational concerns through appropriate channels helps maintain the standards our clients expect. Tuesday morning brought the resolution I'd been building towards since Diana's first harassment session. Janet Morrison called an emergency department meeting to announce management changes that would restore operational effectiveness and client confidence. Diana was conspicuously absent from the gathering, having been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the investigation into her hiring and management practices. Effective immediately, Sarah Mitchell will serve as interim department director while we complete our assessment of organizational structure and leadership requirements, Janet announced to the assembled team. Her client relationships and technical expertise make her the natural choice to ensure continuity during this transition period. The promotion was both vindication and opportunity, recognizing my value to the company while providing authority to rebuild the department culture that Diana had systematically undermined. More importantly, the interim director role positioned me to manage the Bradley Sports marketing contract personally, ensuring that TechFlow could capitalize on the industry connections I'd maintained throughout my career. Carlos led the spontaneous applause that greeted Janet's announcement, and I could see relief on every team member's face as they realized the harassment and micromanagement were finally over. The department could return to collaborative productivity instead of defensive survival under Diana's toxic leadership. After the team meeting, Janet requested a private conversation to discuss both the interim role and the broader implications of her investigation findings. Her office felt different this time, more like a strategic planning session than a crisis management discussion. Sarah, I want you to know that your documentation and analysis were instrumental in identifying serious problems with both Diana's hiring process and her subsequent management decisions, Janet began. The investigation revealed external influences on personnel decisions that violate our corporate governance policies and create legal liability issues. Her acknowledgement validated everything I'd documented about Patricia's manipulation and Diana's systematic harassment. More importantly, it confirmed that TechFlow's leadership was committed to maintaining ethical standards regardless of external pressure or personal relationships. The Bradley Sports marketing contract you've brought to our attention represents exactly the kind of growth opportunity we've been seeking, Janet continued. Your unique qualifications and industry connections make you invaluable not just for this specific project, but for our broader expansion into sports technology markets. The conversation concluded with Janet offering me the permanent director position, along with a compensation package that reflected both my expanded responsibilities and the revenue I'd be generating through my industry connections. The offer included equity participation that would make me one of TechFlow's most significant individual stakeholders, transforming my role from employee to partner in the company's future success. Walking back to my desk after accepting Janet's offer, I felt the profound satisfaction of a championship victory earned through skill, strategy, and perseverance rather than luck or favoritism. Diana and Patricia had assumed they were manipulating someone whose career they could destroy through systematic harassment and corporate politics. Instead, they'd forced me to demonstrate capabilities and activate resources that elevated my professional status beyond anything I'd previously achieved. That afternoon brought a call from Michael expressing confusion about rumors he'd heard regarding workplace changes and my promotion to director. His tone suggested he was beginning to recognize patterns in his mother's behavior that he'd previously dismissed or ignored. "Sarah, did my mother really try to interfere with your job?" he asked directly, abandoning his usual conflict avoidance in favor of honest inquiry. "Some things people are saying don't make sense unless she was involved in getting your boss hired." His question represented the first time Michael had directly acknowledged Patricia's inappropriate interference in our lives. The evidence of her corporate manipulation had apparently become too obvious to dismiss through his typical strategies of minimization and denial. "Your mother and Diana are tennis partners," I replied carefully. The timing of Diana's hiring and subsequent management decisions created some operational challenges that needed to be addressed through appropriate channels. Michael was silent for a moment, processing implications that challenged his fundamental assumptions about his mother's behavior and motivations. "I'm starting to realize there's a lot about my mother's activities that I haven't wanted to see," he said finally. "I owe you an apology for not recognizing how inappropriate her interference has been." His acknowledgement felt like a breakthrough in our relationship, suggesting that Patricia's overreach had finally exceeded even Michael's tolerance for her manipulative behavior. The conspiracy to destroy my career had backfired by forcing both of us to confront patterns that we'd previously managed to overlook or rationalize. Wednesday brought news that Diana's administrative leave had become permanent termination following the completion of TechFlow's investigation. The findings had revealed not only her falsified credentials and previous misconduct, but also documented evidence of the external pressure that had influenced her hiring. Patricia's fingerprints were all over personnel decisions that violated corporate governance policies and created legal liability for the company. More satisfying was the information that Patricia herself was facing consequences for her corporate interference. Several board members at TechFlow had social connections that made them aware of her boasting about manipulating personnel decisions, and they were not amused by her assumption that social relationships granted her influence over company operations. Her country club standing was suffering as word spread about her inappropriate behavior and failed attempt at corporate manipulation. The Bradley Sports marketing contract was signed on Thursday morning in a ceremony that included Tom Bradley, Janet Morrison, and several other TechFlow executives. The partnership would position our company as a leader in sports technology consulting, while providing me with industry connections that would drive additional business development for years to come. "Sarah, I have to admit that your championship background was one of the primary factors that made my clients comfortable with this partnership," Tom said during the signing ceremony. "They respect authentic expertise more than credentials, and your combination of technical skills and sports industry credibility is exactly what they've been seeking." His comments reminded me that the identity I'd maintained quietly throughout my corporate career had always been an asset, rather than something to minimize or hide. Diana and Patricia's attempt to diminish my professional standing had instead forced me to fully embrace and leverage capabilities that made me uniquely valuable in ways they'd never bothered to understand. Friday afternoon brought the final resolution when Patricia called to request a meeting that she characterized as important family business. Her tone carried none of the manipulative confidence that had characterized our previous interactions, suggesting that the complete failure of her corporate conspiracy had finally forced her to recognize the futility of continued conflict. We met at a neutral location downtown rather than the country club where she typically held court. Patricia's appearance reflected the stress of having her social standing and corporate influence exposed as ineffective against someone who possessed legitimate professional capabilities and strategic thinking skills. "Sarah, I believe there have been some misunderstandings about my involvement in Diana's hiring and subsequent workplace dynamics," Patricia began, her tone suggesting she was hoping to negotiate a face-saving resolution rather than admit direct wrongdoing. Her attempt to minimize her role was both predictable and futile. The evidence of her manipulation was too extensive and well documented to be dismissed as misunderstanding or coincidence. "I think the situation is quite clear, Patricia," I replied calmly. "Your attempt to interfere with my career through corporate manipulation has been unsuccessful and has created consequences for everyone involved." Patricia's composure cracked slightly as she realized I wasn't going to provide the gracious acceptance of her non-apology that would allow her to maintain dignity while retreating from the conflict she'd initiated. "I hope you realize that family relationships are more important than workplace disagreements," she said, making one final attempt to reframe the situation as petty professional conflict rather than serious harassment and manipulation. "I agree completely," I replied. "That's why it's so unfortunate that you chose to weaponize corporate environments against family members rather than addressing concerns through direct communication." The conversation concluded with Patricia's reluctant acknowledgement that her interference had been inappropriate, and her commitment to avoiding future involvement in my professional life. While she stopped short of a formal apology, her recognition of boundaries represented a significant shift from her previous assumption that she could manipulate any situation to achieve her preferred outcomes. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred over the past month. Patricia's sophisticated conspiracy to destroy my career had instead elevated me to executive leadership, while exposing her own limitations and forcing accountability for her manipulative behavior. Diana's systematic harassment had backfired by compelling me to demonstrate capabilities that made me indispensable to my company's most important growth strategies. Most importantly, the entire experience had reconnected me with the competitive instincts and strategic thinking that had once made me a champion. I'd rediscovered professional confidence and personal strength that had been dormant during years of avoiding conflict and minimizing my own capabilities to accommodate other people's insecurities. The tennis metaphors that had seemed so appropriate when Diana and Patricia launched their campaign had proven more prophetic than they'd realized. They'd served their best shots with precision and strategy, but they'd been playing against an opponent whose championship credentials were authentic rather than assumed. When the match concluded, there was no question about who possessed superior skills, preparation, and mental toughness. Saturday morning found me in my new director's office, preparing for the expanded responsibilities and opportunities that my promotion had created. The Bradley Sports Marketing Partnership was already generating additional leads from other sports industry clients who wanted to work with someone who understood their unique requirements and challenges. As I reviewed project timelines and team assignments, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to reclaim capabilities I'd allowed to atrophy during years of professional routine. Diana and Patricia's harassment campaign had been intended to diminish and eventually destroy my career. Instead, it had catalyzed the most significant professional advancement of my life, while reconnecting me with the authentic identity and competitive spirit that had always been my greatest strengths. The final irony was that Patricia had achieved exactly the opposite of her intended outcome. Rather than putting me in my place, she'd elevated me to a position of authority and influence that exceeded anything I'd previously imagined possible. Her manipulation had backfired so completely that I was now stronger professionally, financially, and personally than I'd been before her interference began. Looking out my director's office window at the Austin skyline, I smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won the most important match of their career. The victory was sweeter because it had been earned through legitimate skill and strategic thinking rather than manipulation or favoritism. I'd faced down professional harassment, corporate politics, and family interference with the same mental toughness that had once carried me to a state championship. Patricia had served her ace, but I'd returned it with interest. Game, set, and match to the former tennis champion, who'd remembered exactly how to win when it mattered most. 6 months later, I stood on the rooftop terrace of Austin's newest high-rise building, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, while celebrating TechFlow Solutions' most successful quarter in company history. The building below us housed our expanded offices, necessitated by the explosive growth that had followed our entry into the sports technology market. What had begun as a single contract with Bradley Sports Marketing had evolved into partnerships with 12 major sports organizations, generating revenue that exceeded our previous annual totals every month. The celebration around me buzzed with energy from employees, clients, and industry partners who had gathered to mark not just our financial success, but our emergence as a leader in sports analytics technology. Tom Bradley moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone whose strategic gamble had paid off spectacularly, introducing potential clients to the team that had made their ambitious projects possible. Janet Morrison stood near the edge of the terrace, deep in conversation with investors who were eager to fund our next phase of expansion. I watched these interactions with the satisfied awareness of someone who had orchestrated a transformation that extended far beyond personal vindication. The harassment campaign that Diana and Patricia had launched to destroy my career had instead catalyzed the most significant professional achievement of my life, creating opportunities that benefited everyone around me while demonstrating the power of authentic expertise over manipulative politics. Carlos approached with 2 glasses of champagne and the broad smile of someone whose own career had been elevated by our department's success. His promotion to senior technical director had come with equity participation and responsibility for managing our most complex client implementations. Hard to believe this all started with you getting a new boss who tried to make your life miserable, he said, raising his glass in a toast. His observation captured the profound irony of our situation. Diana's systematic attempt to undermine my professional standing had forced me to activate capabilities and connections that transformed not just my own career, but the trajectory of our entire company. What she'd intended as career destruction had become the foundation for unprecedented growth and opportunity. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us create space for the best things to emerge, I replied, clinking my glass against his. Though I have to admit, I didn't see it that way when she was scheduling those brutal weekly reviews. Our conversation was interrupted by Jennifer Park, who had become our new Human Resources Director following her exceptional handling of the investigation that had exposed Diana's misconduct and Patricia's corporate interference. Her role had expanded significantly as we'd grown from a small team to a division spanning 3 floors and employing over 60 specialists in sports technology consulting. "Sarah, there's someone here who specifically requested to meet you," Jennifer said, gesturing toward a distinguished woman in an elegant navy suit who was examining the awards display we'd set up to showcase our recent industry recognition. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the University of Texas Sports Management Program. She's interested in discussing a potential partnership for student internships and research collaboration. The academic connection represented another validation of how far our reputation had grown within the sports industry. Universities were seeking partnerships with our team because we'd established credibility that extended beyond consulting into genuine thought leadership and innovation. The research possibilities excited me almost as much as the client work, offering opportunities to develop next-generation analytics tools that could reshape how sports organizations understood performance and fan engagement. As I made my way toward Dr. Martinez, I passed a group of our newest employees, who were discussing project assignments with the enthusiasm of people who recognized they were part of something significant. Many of them had been recruited from major sports organizations and technology companies, drawn by our reputation for innovative work and collaborative culture. Their talent and energy had accelerated our growth while reinforcing the positive team dynamics that I'd prioritized during our expansion. "Dr. Martinez, thank you for joining us this evening," I said, extending my hand as I approached the awards display. "Jennifer mentioned your interest in academic partnerships. I'd love to hear more about your vision for collaboration." Her handshake was firm, and her eyes held the analytical sharpness I associated with serious researchers. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been following your company's work since the Bradley partnership was announced. Your approach to combining traditional sports analysis with advanced technology platforms is exactly what our students need to understand if they want to succeed in modern sports management." Our conversation revealed opportunities for collaboration that extended well beyond simple internship programs. Dr. Martinez was interested in joint research projects that could advance both academic understanding and practical applications of sports analytics. Her program had funding for initiatives that aligned with industry needs, creating possibilities for development work that could benefit both university research and our client services. "We're particularly interested in your championship background and how that perspective influences your approach to sports technology," Dr. Martinez continued. "There's a significant gap between academic theory and practical application that someone with your competitive experience and technical expertise could help bridge." Her comment reminded me of how completely my professional identity had evolved over the past 6 months. The tennis championship that I'd once minimized as irrelevant to corporate success had become one of my most valuable professional assets, providing credibility and insight that no amount of traditional business education could replicate. Clients trusted my recommendations because they knew I understood sports from an athlete's perspective as well as a business analyst's viewpoint. As our conversation concluded with plans for a formal partnership proposal, I noticed Michael approaching through the crowd. His expression held pride mixed with something that might have been awe, as he took in the scope of the celebration and the caliber of people who had gathered to honor our achievements. The contrast with his previous tendency to minimize my professional accomplishments was stark and deeply satisfying. "Sarah, this is incredible," he said, gesturing toward the bustling crowd of industry leaders and successful professionals. "I knew your promotion was important, but I didn't realize the scale of what you've built here." His acknowledgement reflected a broader transformation in our relationship that had emerged following Patricia's failed harassment campaign. Michael's recognition of his mother's inappropriate behavior had forced him to re-examine many assumptions about family dynamics and professional achievements. He'd begun setting boundaries with Patricia while actively supporting my career advancement in ways that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "It's been a team effort," I replied, though we both knew that my industry connections and strategic vision had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Having your support during the transition period made a significant difference. Our conversation was interrupted by Tom Bradley, who approached with a man I recognized from industry publications as David Chen, CEO of one of the largest sports marketing agencies in the country. Their presence together suggested discussions that could elevate our partnership to an entirely new level of scope and influence. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet David Chen," Tom said with the satisfaction of someone delivering excellent news. "David's been following our collaboration and has a proposal that could transform how sports organizations approach technology integration across the entire industry." David's handshake carried the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars. "Ms. Mitchell, Tom has told me about your unique combination of competitive experience and technical expertise. My agency represents organizations that collectively spend over $200 million annually on technology consulting. We're looking for a primary partner who can provide both strategic insight and implementation capabilities across all our clients." The proposal he outlined would establish TechFlow as the preferred technology consultant for his entire client roster, creating a revenue stream that would require us to double our current staff within the year. More importantly, it would position us as the dominant force in sports technology consulting, with influence over how an entire industry approached digital transformation and analytics integration. "This partnership would require significant expansion of your capabilities," David continued. "But Tom assures me that your championship mindset and strategic thinking make you uniquely qualified to manage growth of this magnitude, while maintaining the quality standards that have made your current work so successful." His confidence in my abilities reflected recognition that extended far beyond the specific projects we'd completed. Industry leaders were beginning to see me as someone whose judgment and expertise could be trusted with their most important technology investments, creating opportunities that transcended traditional consulting relationships. As our conversation concluded with plans for detailed partnership discussions, I found myself standing alone for a moment on the terrace, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness settled over Austin. The view from this height provided perspective on how dramatically my professional landscape had changed since that Monday morning, when Diana had announced her intention to restructure our department according to her vision of proper management. The irony remained profound and deeply satisfying. Patricia's sophisticated conspiracy to diminish my career had instead elevated me to a position of industry leadership that exceeded anything I'd previously imagined possible. Her manipulation had backfired so completely that I was now more successful professionally, financially, and personally than I'd been before her interference began. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda Martinez, the tennis coach, whose warning about Patricia's bragging had provided crucial intelligence during the darkest period of Diana's harassment campaign. Her message was brief but warmly congratulatory, having seen news coverage of our company's success and my role in the sports technology industry's rapid evolution. The text reminded me of how many people had contributed to my eventual triumph over Patricia and Diana's systematic attempt to destroy my career. Linda's courage in sharing information, Carlos's loyalty during difficult periods, Jennifer's professional integrity during the investigation, Janet Morrison's commitment to operational excellence over personal politics. Each had played crucial roles in exposing the conspiracy and creating opportunities for justice and growth. But perhaps the most important factor had been my decision to reconnect with the competitive instincts and strategic thinking that had once made me a champion. Diana and Patricia had assumed they were manipulating someone whose career they could control through harassment and intimidation. Instead, they'd awakened capabilities that had been dormant during years of routine professional comfort, forcing me to remember exactly what championship-level performance looked like when applied to corporate challenges. As the celebration continued around me, I reflected on lessons learned through this experience that extended far beyond immediate professional advancement. The harassment campaign had taught me that authentic expertise and genuine capability would ultimately triumph over manipulation and political maneuvering, but only if I was willing to fight strategically, rather than hoping problems would resolve themselves through accommodation or avoidance. The tennis metaphors that had seemed so appropriate throughout our conflict had proven remarkably accurate. Patricia and Diana had served their best shots with precision and apparent strategic advantage, but they'd been playing against an opponent whose championship credentials were legitimate rather than assumed. When the match concluded, there was no question about who possessed superior preparation, mental toughness, and authentic skill. Janet Morrison approached as the evening began winding down, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose leadership decisions had been thoroughly validated by subsequent events. Her investigation of Diana's hiring and management practices had required courage and integrity, challenging personnel decisions that had been influenced by external pressure and personal relationships. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you again for bringing those operational concerns to my attention," Janet said, handing me one of the coffee cups. "Your documentation and analysis were crucial for identifying problems that could have caused significant damage if they'd been allowed to continue." Her acknowledgement reminded me of how close Diana's harassment campaign had come to succeeding. Without careful documentation and strategic presentation of evidence, this systematic undermining of my position might have eventually achieved Patricia's objective of forcing my resignation or justifying my termination. "I'm grateful you were willing to investigate thoroughly rather than dismissing concerns as personality conflicts," I replied. "It took courage to challenge decisions that had been influenced by external relationships." Janet nodded thoughtfully, clearly aware of the broader implications beyond my individual situation. "The experience taught us important lessons about corporate governance and hiring practices. We've implemented new procedures to ensure that external influence can't compromise our personnel decisions or create liability issues." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my assistant, Maria Rodriguez, who had become indispensable as our department's growth had accelerated beyond anything normal organizational structures could support. Her efficiency and strategic thinking had enabled me to focus on high-level relationship management and business development, while ensuring that operational details received proper attention. "Sarah, the car is ready whenever you're prepared to leave," Maria said quietly. "Your 7 a.m. breakfast meeting tomorrow is confirmed, and I've prepared briefing materials for the 3 client calls scheduled before lunch." Her reminder of tomorrow's packed schedule reflected the reality of success that still sometimes surprised me with its intensity and scope. The opportunities created by our sports technology partnerships required constant attention and strategic thinking, but the work was energizing rather than exhausting because it aligned perfectly with my authentic capabilities and interests. As I prepared to leave the celebration, Tom Bradley approached for a final conversation about upcoming projects and strategic planning. His satisfaction with our partnership was evident in both his demeanor and the continued expansion of opportunities he was bringing to our collaboration. "Sarah, I have to admit that recommending you for that first contract was one of the best business decisions I've ever made," Tom said with genuine warmth. "Your combination of competitive insight and analytical rigor has exceeded every expectation, and my clients specifically request your involvement on their most important projects." His acknowledgement validated the strategic choice I'd made to fully embrace my championship background rather than minimizing it as irrelevant to corporate success. The authentic expertise that came from understanding sports at the highest competitive level had become my greatest professional asset, differentiating our services in ways that traditional business credentials never could. "Working with championship-level athletes and organizations has been incredibly fulfilling," I replied. "There's something powerful about applying competitive principles to business challenges and seeing how the same strategic thinking translates across different environments." Our conversation concluded with Tom outlining expansion opportunities that would extend our influence into international sports markets, creating possibilities for growth that could establish TechFlow as a global leader in sports technology consulting. The vision was ambitious but achievable. built on foundations of authentic expertise and proven performance rather than inflated promises or manipulated relationships. Driving home through Austin's quiet streets, I reflected on the profound personal transformation that had accompanied my professional advancement. The harassment campaign that had initially felt like an attack on my identity had actually forced me to reconnect with the most authentic and powerful aspects of myself, creating integration between my competitive background and corporate capabilities that made me more effective than I'd ever been previously. The experience had also clarified the difference between relationships based on mutual respect and recognition versus those built on accommodation and power imbalances. Michael's growing appreciation for my professional achievements reflected his evolution towards seeing me as a complete person, rather than just someone whose primary role was supporting his comfort and convenience. Patricia's retreat from active interference in our lives had created space for healthier family dynamics based on appropriate boundaries rather than manipulative control. Her failed attempt to destroy my career had ultimately strengthened my position, while exposing the limitations of her influence when confronted with legitimate capability and strategic resistance. Most importantly, the entire experience had reminded me that authentic achievement and genuine expertise would ultimately prevail over manipulation and political maneuvering, but only if I was willing to compete at the highest level, rather than hoping that accommodation and avoidance would somehow produce positive outcomes. As I arrived home to find Michael waiting with champagne and genuine enthusiasm for celebrating my success, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to remember exactly who I was capable of being when circumstances demanded championship-level performance. Diana and Patricia's harassment campaign had been intended to diminish and control me, but it had instead catalyzed the most significant personal and professional growth of my adult life. The final irony was that Patricia had achieved exactly the opposite of her intended outcome, while teaching me lessons about resilience, strategy, and authentic power that would serve me throughout whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. Her manipulation had backfired so completely that I was now stronger, more successful, and more authentic than I'd been before her interference began. Looking toward the future from this position of strength and clarity, I felt the confident anticipation of someone who had rediscovered their championship capabilities and was eager for whatever competition might come next. Patricia had served her ace, but I'd won the match, and the victory had reminded me exactly what it felt like to play at my highest level when everything that mattered was on the line. The tennis champion who had once dominated courts across Texas had found her way back to competitive excellence, this time in corporate environments where strategic thinking, mental toughness, and authentic expertise determined winners and losers with the same clarity as any championship match. Game, set, and match to the competitor who had never really forgotten how to win when it mattered most. 2 years after the celebration on the rooftop terrace, I found myself standing in the gleaming conference room of our new headquarters building, preparing to sign the acquisition papers that would make TechFlow Solutions a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Sports Analytics, the largest sports technology conglomerate in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me that the company Patricia had tried to use as a weapon against my career was now being purchased specifically because of the value I had created through my authentic expertise and championship mindset. The acquisition negotiation had taken 8 months to complete, with Global Sports Analytics making it clear from the first meeting that their primary interest was in securing my leadership and the revolutionary approach to sports technology integration that had emerged from our partnership with Bradley Sports Marketing. The final purchase price of $420 million represented validation that exceeded even my most ambitious projections when I had first activated my dormant tennis connections. David Chen sat across the polished mahogany table, reviewing contract details with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic gamble had produced extraordinary returns. His agency's partnership with TechFlow had generated over $600 million in technology consulting revenue across his client roster, establishing us as the undisputed leader in sports analytics implementation. The acquisition would allow him to offer his clients seamless technology solutions, while providing Global Sports Analytics with immediate access to relationships that had taken decades to develop. Sarah, I want you to know that this acquisition wouldn't be happening without your unique combination of competitive insight and technical leadership, David said as we prepared for the final signatures. Global Sports Analytics specifically requested that your 5-year leadership contract be non-negotiable. They understand that your championship background is irreplaceable in this industry. His observation reflected how completely the professional landscape had shifted since Diana's first attempt to undermine my client relationships. The tennis championship that Patricia had dismissed as irrelevant to serious business had become the foundation for building one of the most valuable sports technology companies in the world. My competitive experience provided insights that no amount of traditional business education could replicate, creating sustainable competitive advantages that major corporations were willing to pay unprecedented amounts to access. The signing ceremony concluded with handshakes and photographs that would be featured in industry publications as evidence of how quickly the sports technology sector was consolidating around proven expertise, rather than speculative innovation. As the new Chief Executive Officer of TechFlow under Global Sports Analytics ownership, I would oversee expansion into European and Asian markets, while maintaining the collaborative culture that had enabled our rapid growth. Janet Morrison approached as the formal proceedings concluded, carrying champagne and wearing the proud smile of someone whose leadership decisions had been thoroughly validated by extraordinary outcomes. Her courage in investigating Diana's misconduct and supporting my strategic vision had played a crucial role in creating the environment where authentic capability could flourish, despite external manipulation and political interference. Sarah, watching your transformation over the past 2 years has been one of the most inspiring experiences of my career, Janet said as we moved toward the reception area where employees and partners were gathering to celebrate the acquisition. You've demonstrated that integrity and authentic expertise will ultimately triumph over any amount of manipulation or political maneuvering. Her acknowledgement reminded me of how close Diana's harassment campaign had come to succeeding before I found the courage to fight back strategically rather than hoping accommodation would somehow resolve the conflict. The documentation and evidence gathering that had felt so overwhelming during those difficult weeks had ultimately provided the foundation for exposing corporate governance violations that protected not just my career but the entire company's operational integrity. The reception buzzed with conversations between employees, clients, and industry partners who had gathered to mark not just the acquisition but the broader transformation that TechFlow represented within the sports technology sector. Carlos moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone whose own career had been elevated by our department's success, his new role as Chief Technology Officer carrying equity participation that would make him financially independent within the decade. Tom Bradley stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin, deep in conversation with representatives from 3 major sports leagues, who were interested in expanding their technology partnerships through our enhanced capabilities under Global Sports Analytics ownership. His strategic decision to recommend me for that first consulting contract had generated returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections, while establishing Bradley Sports Marketing as the premier agency for technology integration consulting. As I moved through the celebration, accepting congratulations and discussing future opportunities with industry leaders, I reflected on the profound personal growth that had accompanied this professional transformation. The harassment campaign that had initially felt like an existential threat to my career had actually forced me to integrate authentic capabilities that made me more effective than I had ever been during years of routine corporate comfort. The experience had taught me that sustainable success required the courage to compete at the highest level, rather than hoping that accommodation and conflict avoidance would somehow produce positive outcomes. Diana and Patricia's systematic attempt to destroy my career had awakened competitive instincts that had been dormant since my championship playing days, forcing me to remember exactly what peak performance looked like when applied to corporate challenges. Michael appeared at my side with champagne, and the genuine pride that had characterized his attitude toward my professional achievements, ever since Patricia's failed manipulation campaign, had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about family dynamics and enabling behavior. His evolution from conflict avoidance to active support had strengthened our relationship while demonstrating that authentic growth was possible when circumstances demanded honest self-examination. I still can't quite believe this is the same woman who used to downplay her tennis background to avoid making other people uncomfortable, Michael said with affectionate amazement. Watching you embrace your competitive identity and build something this significant has been incredible. His observation captured the fundamental transformation that had occurred not just in my professional standing, but in my willingness to occupy space and claim recognition that I had earned through legitimate achievement. The years of minimizing my capabilities to accommodate other people's insecurities had been replaced by confident ownership of expertise that created value for everyone around me. Sometimes it takes external pressure to remind us who we really are beneath the roles we think we're supposed to play, I replied, thinking of Patricia's unwitting contribution to my personal and professional development. Diana's harassment campaign forced me to rediscover capabilities I had forgotten I possessed. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, whose academic partnership with TechFlow had evolved into one of the most influential sports management research programs in the country. Her students were now recruited by major sports organizations specifically because of their training in technology integration and analytics implementation, creating a pipeline of talent that reinforced our industry leadership. Sarah, the acquisition announcement has generated tremendous excitement in academic circles, Dr. Martinez said with scholarly enthusiasm. Several universities are interested in establishing similar partnerships with global sports analytics, recognizing that your approach represents the future of sports management education. Her comments reflected how completely my professional identity had evolved from someone who minimized her background to avoid conflict to someone whose expertise was actively sought by the most prestigious institutions in the field. The championship credentials that I had once treated as irrelevant to serious business had become the foundation for influencing how an entire industry approached talent development and strategic thinking. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found myself standing again at the windows overlooking Austin, watching the city lights twinkle in patterns that seemed to mirror the scattered memories of everything that had led to this moment. The view from this height provided perspective on how dramatically my landscape had changed since that Monday morning, when Diana had announced her intention to restructure our department according to her vision of proper management hierarchy. The acquisition represented more than financial success or professional vindication, though both were deeply satisfying after the systematic attempt to destroy my career through corporate manipulation. It demonstrated that authentic expertise and strategic thinking would ultimately create sustainable value that transcended any individual relationship or political maneuvering, building foundations that could support growth beyond what manipulation or accommodation could ever achieve. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda Martinez, the tennis coach whose courage in sharing information about Patricia's bragging had provided crucial intelligence during the investigation that exposed Diana's misconduct. Her text contained news that Patricia had quietly resigned from the country club's board of directors, following continued fallout from her inappropriate interference in corporate personnel decisions, bringing final closure to a chapter that had transformed my understanding of family dynamics and personal boundaries. The message reminded me of how many people had contributed to my eventual triumph over systematic harassment, while demonstrating that integrity and professional courage would ultimately be rewarded when institutions were committed to operational excellence over personal relationships. Linda's decision to share uncomfortable information, Janet's willingness to investigate thoroughly, Carlos's loyalty during difficult periods, each had played crucial roles in creating opportunities for justice and authentic achievement. But perhaps the most important factor had been my decision to stop accommodating inappropriate behavior and start competing at the level that circumstances demanded. Diana and Patricia had assumed they were manipulating someone whose career they could control through intimidation and systematic undermining. Instead, they had awakened capabilities that transformed not just my individual situation, but the trajectory of everyone connected to our success. As the final guests prepared to leave and the celebration concluded, Tom Bradley approached for a conversation about strategic planning and future opportunities under global sports analytics ownership. His satisfaction with our partnership was evident in his demeanor and the continued expansion of possibilities he was bringing to our collaboration as we prepared for international market development. Sarah, I have to say that recommending you for that first contract remains the best business decision I've made in 30 years of sports marketing, Tom said with genuine warmth. Your championship mindset and strategic thinking have created value that extends far beyond what any of us initially envisioned. His acknowledgement validated the integration of competitive identity with corporate capability that had emerged from the crisis Patricia had created through her harassment campaign. The tennis champion who had once minimized her background to avoid conflict had evolved into a business leader whose authentic expertise commanded respect from the most successful professionals in the sports industry. Working at this level has reminded me why I loved competition in the first place, I replied, thinking of the strategic challenges and high-stakes decision-making that characterized our daily operations. There's something powerful about applying championship principles to business problems and seeing how authentic capability creates sustainable advantages. Driving home through Austin's quiet streets after the acquisition celebration, I reflected on lessons learned through this experience that would influence every future challenge and opportunity. The harassment campaign had taught me that accommodation and conflict avoidance would never create the outcomes that strategic competition could achieve, but only when I was willing to embrace authentic capabilities rather than minimizing them to make other people comfortable. The tennis metaphors that had seemed appropriate throughout our conflict had proven remarkably prophetic. Patricia and Diana had served their best shots with apparent strategic advantage, but they had been playing against an opponent whose championship credentials were legitimate rather than assumed. When the final point was played, there was no question about who possessed superior preparation, mental toughness, and authentic skill. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that sustainable success required the courage to compete at the highest level while maintaining integrity and treating people with respect, regardless of how they had chosen to treat me. The victory was sweeter because it had been earned through legitimate capability rather than manipulation, creating value for everyone involved rather than simply defeating opponents through superior political maneuvering. As I arrived home to find Michael waiting with flowers and genuine enthusiasm for celebrating this milestone, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to remember exactly who I was capable of being when circumstances demanded championship-level performance. Diana and Patricia's harassment campaign had been intended to diminish and control me, but it had instead catalyzed the most significant personal and professional growth of my adult life, while creating opportunities that exceeded anything I had previously imagined possible. The final irony remained that Patricia had achieved exactly the opposite of her intended outcome, while inadvertently providing the catalyst for transformation that elevated not just my individual success, but the achievements of everyone connected to our journey. Her manipulation had backfired so completely that I was now more successful, more authentic, and more fulfilled than I had been before her interference began, with influence that extended across an entire industry rather than being confined to the narrow role she had tried to force me to accept. Looking toward the future from this position of strength and clarity, I felt the confident anticipation of someone who had rediscovered championship capabilities and was eager for whatever competition might emerge next. The tennis champion who had once dominated courts across Texas had found her way back to competitive excellence, this time in corporate environments where strategic thinking, mental toughness, and authentic expertise determined winners and losers with the same clarity as any championship match. Patricia had served her ace with precision and apparent strategic advantage, but the match had concluded with decisive victory for the competitor, who had never really forgotten how to win when everything that mattered was on the line. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.